At 6:48 on a Saturday morning, I pulled one steel lever inside a switching shed I had built 34 years earlier, and 112 expensive homes across the creek went dark at the exact same moment. Their air conditioners stopped, their refrigerators went quiet, and the pumps at the neighborhood pool died 6 hours before the biggest summer party their HOA had ever planned. What none of those people knew was that every light, every television, and every cold beer in that subdivision had been running on electricity stolen from my land for nearly a decade. My name is Walter Hayes, and I have lived at Cedar Hollow Ranch in Mason County, Texas, since the summer I married my wife, June. Her father used to joke that she married me for my smile. But after 42 years together, she will tell you she stayed because I know how to keep the well pump running during a lightning storm. That is probably closer to the truth. Cedar Hollow is 420 acres of limestone, cedar trees, stubborn cattle, and machinery old enough to have opinions. My grandfather bought the first piece after coming home from Korea. My father added the north pasture, and I bought him out in 1987 after 20 years working as a transmission engineer. 4 years later, I built my own small substation near the equipment barn, mostly because the irrigation pumps and deep wells demanded more power than the old rural line could reliably provide. I knew every bolt in that station. I knew which transformer hummed louder in August, which cabinet door swelled after heavy rain, and which meter had to be tapped twice before the needle settled. June said I trusted that substation more than most people. I told her the substation had never lied to me. Then Briar Ridge Estates appeared across our western fence. A developer named Calvin Mercer bought 600 acres, carved it into luxury lots, and sold newcomers the promise of quiet country living without mentioning that quiet country living includes dust, cattle noise, and the occasional smell that no scented candle can defeat. The homes were large, the gates were decorative, and the HOA newsletter used the word lifestyle so often I began to wonder whether they had purchased it wholesale. I did not pay much attention until the electric bill arrived in August of 2016. My usage had more than tripled. I read the number once, then again, then held the page near the kitchen window as though better sunlight might make it less ridiculous. June was slicing peaches at the counter. "You planning to stare that bill into submission?" she asked. "Something is pulling power from the station," I said. She set down the knife. "Something of ours?" "No." I carried my meter kit to the substation, checked the irrigation panel, the wells, the barn, and the house feed. Everything on my side was normal, but the secondary panel showed a load large enough to power a small neighborhood. So I followed it. For nearly 2 hours I walked the fence line under a sun mean enough to blister paint. Near the southwest corner, I found a strip of soil darker than the ground around it. Someone had dug there recently, then scattered dry leaves over the trench like that would fool anyone who had spent his life looking at disturbed earth. 20 inches down was an underground conduit crossing beneath my fence. It ran straight toward Briar Ridge. The connection inside my panel was crude, undersized, and dangerously ungrounded. Whoever installed it knew enough to steal electricity, but not enough to care who might die servicing the line later. I photographed everything, measured the depth, marked the coordinates, then went home and laid the pictures beside the bill. June sat across from me, quiet for a long moment. "What are you going to do, Walter?" I looked at the photographs, then toward the western pasture where the roofs of Briar Ridge glowed orange in the evening sun. "I'm going to wait," I said. She studied my face. "That sounds more dangerous than getting angry." It was. Waiting did not mean doing nothing, though that was the part people misunderstood later. I called an attorney named Martin Cole, a patient man with gray hair, narrow glasses, and the unnerving habit of letting silence do half his work. Martin looked at the photographs, studied the bills, and asked me one question. "Can you prove the connection stays active?" I told him I could prove it every day until somebody removed it, so that was what we did. Every month, I saved the bill. Every 6 months, I photographed the buried conduit from the same angle, measured the depth, checked the load, and wrote down the weather conditions. Martin opened a file and added to it year after year while Briar Ridge kept growing more comfortable on power its residents did not know was stolen. Calvin Mercer sold the last home, closed his development office, and mostly disappeared, but his wife, Marissa, stayed behind in the largest house near the subdivision entrance. She became HOA president in 2021, and within 3 months, she decided Cedar Hollow Ranch was the greatest threat facing civilized society. First, it was my tractor. Then it was the cattle. Then it was the equipment barn, which she called an industrial eyesore even though it had been standing there since before her swimming pool was a hole in the ground. She filed complaints with the county, the road department, and one memorable complaint with the state environmental office claiming my cows were emotionally disturbing the residents near the western fence. The inspector who came out was an old ranch kid from Abilene. He stared at the cattle for 10 minutes, stared at Marissa's written complaint, then asked me whether any of the cows had threatened her personally. I said not that I was aware of, but the red heifer had poor manners. He laughed so hard he had to lean against his truck. Marissa did not find that story amusing when someone repeated it at an HOA meeting. Her complaints grew sharper after that, and so did her Facebook posts. She photographed my barn with a long lens, called my property neglected, and warned residents that rural landowners sometimes resisted progress because they feared accountability. I read that line twice. There was something almost artistic about a woman using electricity stolen from my ranch to publish a lecture about accountability. Most people in Briar Ridge stayed quiet, but one resident did not. Her name was Ruth Dalton, a retired school librarian who lived in the smallest home in the subdivision and grown up on a sheep farm near Junction. One Sunday afternoon, she walked down my gravel drive carrying a peach pie and said, "Mr. Sully, Hayes, I want you to know Marissa does not speak for all of us." June invited her inside before I could answer, which was how Ruth became part of our Sunday coffee routine. For several months, we talked about books, weather, grandchildren, and the particular foolishness of buying white furniture in Texas. Eventually, Ruth began telling us what happened inside the HOA meetings. Marissa wanted control over everything she could see from her back terrace, and because my pasture was the one thing she could see but could not control, she had turned it into a personal obsession. Ruth said Marissa believed property values depended on making the surrounding countryside look like an extension of the subdivision. I told her the countryside had been doing fine before the subdivision arrived. Ruth smiled. "That is why she hates you, Walter. You are proof that the world existed before she organized it." The real turning point came the following June when Marissa sent me a letter on HOA stationery claiming that my electrical infrastructure extended into community airspace and was therefore subject to inspection and corrective action. My power line was entirely on my property, but the letter said the HOA reserved the right to remove any installation it considered unsafe or visually disruptive. I called Martin. He read the letter once and went quiet. Then he said, "Walter, she has finally put the threat in writing." I knew what he meant. For 8 years, we had evidence of the theft, but the people responsible could still argue confusion, contractor error, or some undocumented agreement made by a former owner. What we needed was deliberate interference by someone currently acting for the HOA. 3 weeks later, Marissa provided it. I was replacing a fuel pump in the machine shop when I heard a chainsaw rev outside. I stepped through the open door and saw 2 men in yellow vests standing beneath the overhead service line that powered my shop. Marissa stood beside them in white shorts and a pale blue tennis top, holding her phone in one hand and a clipboard in the other. She looked pleased with herself. "Mr. Hayes," she called, "we're correcting an encroachment." "That line is on my land," I said. "The pole is on my land," I said. "The pole is on my land. The air above it is on my land." She gave me the kind of smile people use when they have mistaken confidence for authority. "The HOA has reviewed the matter." "No, Marissa, you reviewed the matter." "No, Marissa, you reviewed the matter. Those are not the same thing." One of the workers lowered the saw. He looked uncertain. Marissa pointed at the wire. "Cut it." I took 1 step forward. "Son, that line is live." He looked at her again. She said, "He is trying to intimidate you. Do your job." The saw rose, the chain bit through the cable, and a white flash snapped across the fence. The shop went silent behind me. Marissa lowered her phone and smiled. "Maybe now you will learn to cooperate with your community." I did not answer. I turned around, walked into the house, and found June standing in the kitchen as the lights flickered from the damaged feed. She looked at my face and did not ask what happened. "Today," she said. "Yes," I told her. "Today." I called Martin and told him the entire thing had been recorded by 3 security cameras, including Marissa ordering the crew to cut a live line. He exhaled slowly. 8 years, Walter. 8 years, and she just handed us the final page. By sundown, the sheriff, the State Utility Commission, and 2 investigators from the Texas Rangers had copies of the footage. Martin filed for an emergency order before the courthouse closed, and the next afternoon he arrived at my kitchen table carrying a signed document in a clear sleeve. The judge had written 1 sentence beneath her signature. "Mr. Hayes may disconnect the unauthorized service at his discretion." June poured Martin a cup of coffee, then looked at me. "What time?" I folded the order and glanced toward the western horizon, where the lights of Briar Ridge were beginning to come on one by one. 6:48 tomorrow morning, I said. Martin raised an eyebrow. "Why 6:48? Because that is when Marissa's pool maintenance crew starts setting up for her summer celebration, and I want every agency present before anybody touches that line. June shook her head, almost smiling. Walter, sometimes I cannot tell whether you are the calmest man I know or the most dangerous. I looked through the kitchen window at the subdivision glowing on electricity it had never paid for. Neither could I. By 6:15 the next morning, my equipment barn looked less like a ranch building and more like a command post. Martin had the court order. A utility engineer named Daniel Price had the disconnect plan. The county sheriff had 2 deputies at the gate, and Captain Owen Briggs from the Texas Rangers stood near the coffee pot looking like a man who had already heard every excuse human beings could invent. June moved among them with a tray of biscuits as if federal investigations happened at our kitchen table every Saturday. At 6:42, Daniel and I walked to the switching shed. The air was already warm, the kind of Texas morning that warned you the afternoon intended to be cruel. He checked the protective gear, confirmed the sequence, then looked at me. Ready? I thought about 8 years of bills, photographs, measurements, complaints, and Marissa smiling while that live wire fell across my driveway. Yes, I said, I am ready. At 6:48, I opened the breaker feeding the illegal connection. Daniel removed the splice, locked the panel, and marked the line out of service. Across the creek, 112 homes went dark in the same breath. No explosion, no dramatic shower of sparks, just the low mechanical click of a lie finally losing power. The first call reached the sheriff's office less than 3 minutes later. By 7:20, dispatch had logged 64 reports. People were angry, confused, and sweating, but they were also told not to approach any utility equipment because an active investigation was underway. Marissa began calling contractors, then the utility company, then anyone she believed should be afraid of her title. Nobody gave her the answer she wanted. The official utility told her Briar Ridge was not listed as a customer. Her regular electrical contractor did not answer because investigators were already questioning him about payments from Calvin Mercer. At 8:11, Marissa drove onto my property in a white SUV with the windows down. She stepped out wearing linen pants, leather sandals, and the expression of someone who had spent her entire morning discovering that authority only works when other people agree you have it. What did you do, Walter? She demanded. I was sitting on the porch beside June. Captain Briggs stood near the railing, though Marissa had not noticed his badge. My substation is operating normally, I said. Then why is our neighborhood without power? Because your neighborhood has been receiving electricity through an illegal connection to my private system since 2016. She stared at me, then laughed once, sharp and nervous. That is absurd. Calvin would never do that. Calvin paid a contractor to install the line after the utility refused to serve the development, Martin said from the doorway. We have the payments, the construction records, and 8 years of load data. Marissa turned toward Captain Briggs. Officer, I want this man arrested. Briggs stepped forward and tipped his hat. Mrs. Mercer, I am Captain Owen Briggs with the Texas Rangers, and at this moment, you are the person being placed under arrest. Her face changed slowly, disbelief first, then anger, then something smaller. Calvin had been detained before sunrise. The contractor had confessed before breakfast. Marissa was arrested for criminal damage, conspiracy, and interference with regulated electrical infrastructure. She did not scream when the cuffs went on. Somehow, that silence felt louder than anything she had ever posted online. The pool party never happened. By noon, local news trucks were parked outside Briar Ridge, and by evening, Ruth Dalton had called an emergency HOA meeting. She laid out the facts without drama, then asked the board to remove every officer connected to Calvin's company. The vote was nearly unanimous. Calvin later pleaded guilty and was ordered to repay millions in restitution. Marissa received a prison sentence for the property damage and the cover-up that followed. The subdivision spent 10 days without power while a legal service line was installed, and I will be honest, that part never felt satisfying. Most of those families had not known they were stealing anything. Children, elderly residents, and decent people suffered because a developer built comfort on top of fraud, and one HOA president chose pride over questions. I granted the utility a proper easement across the southern edge of my ranch, and June and I donated the payments to a rural electrification fund. 2 years later, that money had helped connect 36 low-income families to safe, legal service. Months after everything ended, my granddaughter asked why I had waited so long. I told her sometimes acting quickly stops one bad act, but waiting carefully can expose the whole machine behind it. I still wonder whether I waited too long. Maybe I protected the law and endangered innocent families at the same time. Maybe justice was necessary, but the price was paid by people who never chose the crime. So tell me what you think. Was I right to wait until the evidence was undeniable? Or should I have cut that line the first day I found it? Leave your answer in the comments. Share this story with someone who believes an HOA can never go too far. And subscribe, because sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is not the one shouting. It is the one quietly reading every bill.